Good morning, everyone. So, if you recall, in our prior videos, we did go through some of the chapters, the introduction and the first four chapters in The Psychic Life of Power by Judith Butler. Now, the focus there, as we could in some ways discern, was on how the subject is constituted via a sense of interpellation, in the sense of what it is that they believe that they are called to in terms of their relation to the symbolic order via which they retroactively identify and constitute themselves. Now, I stopped there at chapter 4 because I think the next one was on um, melancholy in refused gender identifications. And while in many ways acknowledging that sexuality is a core of what constitutes the subject, I think that there is a need to investigate what impels the subject rather than merely constitutes them. Uh, Given the direction of our study, and for this, I wanted to pick up Alenka Zupancic's text, The Ethics of the Real. And this, of course, takes us closer and more directly towards the unique movement that is the Ljubljana School of Psychoanalysis, which in many ways um, reactivates Hegelian philosophy for the 21st century in their efforts to read um, Hegel via Lacan. And we will, in some ways, familiarize ourselves in the course of this study regarding what that means and why it may be important. And I think one of the easiest ways to do this is, in fact, to have a read through the introduction of the text that I just mentioned, which is what I would be presenting today. And this does, while introducing this text, does chalk out some of the key positions taken by the school regarding how they interpret decisive figures in the history of philosophy. And I hope that in the course of reading these notes out to you, I may help introduce and familiarize yourself to some of them. Now, having said that, allow me to begin. A reading of the subject in Alenka Zupancic's text, Ethics of the Real, Part 1, Introduction. In the introduction to this text by Alenka Zupancic, we find in the foreword by the other member of the Troika, Zizek, an assertion that is worth raising up. Namely, Lacan's thesis that the Freudian decentred subject of the unconscious is none other than the Cartesian cogito, further radicalized in the Kantian transcendental subject. End of quote. Now, before we proceed further, I would like to say why this is in some ways a radical position within philosophy, which, for example, has come, or rather, the notion of the Cartesian subject, for whatever it's worth, is a point of severe contestation and critique because it has been accused of a certain kind of schism, a certain kind of mind body dualism in terms of its representations of the psyche, of its capacities, of what inherence is. Now, in some of my own written work, such as in my thesis, for example, I try and read Descartes directly and try to explain the kinds of problematics he was dealing with. And mainly, they have to do with epistemic doubt about the grounds on which we accept a claim or a statement or an inference or a perception to be valid, or as to what makes it true. At what extent, or rather, at what degree of scrutiny are we willing to present our own understanding for ourselves in clarifying what it is that we know for certain. And there is an extent in which, in the course of doing this, we find that Descartes is forced to, perhaps in a rhetorical moment, present his own perceptions as possibly invalid. Yet, you need to recognize this as a rhetorical textual moment which may be a reflection of extra textual conditions. What do I mean by this? Um, so, for example, in his text, the discourse on method or meditations on first philosophy, where he refers to a evil genius who may be distorting his mind and things of that kind, I think it's useful to read such moments as allegory, as moments where, for example, an external authority of some kind may invalidate what it is that we believe to be the case for whatever cause or purpose. Now, this is, of course, just an interpretation, and I would welcome you to read the originals yourself. But I thought it would help to have some kind of background to the ways in which some of these problems have been approached in the past in our own reading of this introduction presently. Continuing. This is an angle of inquiry which is perhaps not precedented in the history of philosophy. That is, uh, Lacan's thesis being the Freudian decentered subject of the unconscious is none other than the Cartesian cogito, further radicalized in the Kantian transcendental subject. It is also characteristic of a kind of reading, or perhaps reading strategies, which the Slovenian School of Psychoanalysis has offered us. And I hope to be able to say something about this in the course of this review. A way in which we frame this issue is in terms of extensionality and what we believe our experience of the self is. Language, for example, is a tool for thought. We think through language and it allows us to connect ideas. The written word is a physical manifestation of that tool and is a way in which I can externalize a part of my psyche, say my thoughts about a stale ice cream cone, to another. A pen may allow you to draw an object you may have never seen. A computer may allow you to make a program that can visualize such drawings with geometrical precision. Yet apart from these rather generic examples, our feelings are often a function of such extensionalities. When I read a gripping novel, for instance, the sense of suspense I feel is externalized and embodied in the formulation of the plot in question. When I sit on a motorcycle zipping down the highway, exhilaration is a function of me on that motorcycle and the speed at which we are traveling. This, in a sense, is how we may read the Lacanian concept of the decentered subject. The I which is constitutive of myself is always in some way outside of myself. Better yet, it may be a bricolage of several different extensionalities. The way a painting may be of a vase with a notebook by a window looking out into a cool autumn evening. The Hegelian formulation of this is worth noting. He posits that a plant is an animal with its intestines outside of its body in the form of roots. Put algebraically, the symbolic order is the thing which the human animal uses as their spiritual intestine, the means via which we locate ourselves in the world and via which we make sense of the world. The line of argument which Zizek would like to make here is that both the decentered subject and the Kantian transcendental subject are hence substantially empty. To quote Kant from the Critique of Pure Reason, in the pure thought of myself, I am the being itself, yet no part of this being is given to me thereby for my thought. And I think this is an interesting example to think of. I remember years ago reading a short novella by the great Czech novelist in exile Milan Kundera, titled Slowness. And I think the first chapter begins by recounting a certain carriage ride and about how we today, in our immense addiction to speed of all kinds, to the immediacy of what it is that we want, at the click of a button and things, have lost touch with earlier, older rhythms which were perhaps more in tune with certain biological clocks of ours, such as, our sense of night and day, the seasons, but also other kinds of maybe not industrial, but let's say vocational rhythms, such as, the sense of pedaling on a sewing machine that some earlier instruments required, or maybe even the swaying of a carriage, which can be inducive to storytelling between people, perhaps not even unlike what a galley or a boat may have induced sailors on a particular evening to do. And that was a lovely beginning, but I bring it up as an example of what this emptiness of um the uh, the Freudian, wait, let me find the sentence, uh, as an example of what it means when, for example, Kant would say, in the pure thought of myself I am the being itself, yet no part of this being is given to me thereby for my thought. And I think it's necessary to mention briefly what, if not sublation, what sublimation may entail. So, for example, when I sit on a motorcycle and I'm zipping down and I'm feeling this exhilaration, I'm not really thinking about, for me to experience that exhilaration, I cannot be worrying about, the air pressure in my tires and things of that nature. I mean, those are what is in some ways subtracted in the pure thought of myself, and so on and so forth. Like, for example, if you're a runner, and if you're like seeking to compete in a race and you're running past a rival and things of that kind, um, you would be able to do that only if you don't feel a pain in your ankle, to put it in stupid terms. To continue, the void in which such a subject is produced is for Lacan the Freudian subject of desire. We are introduced to the project of this book as a focus on this assertion of modern subjectivity, which consequently creates a rift between ethics proper and the domain of the good. A provocative formulation is posited, with Lacan siding with Kant against the utilitarians and Christian ethics. It is necessary to recognize in this a provocative introduction, as Kant's categorical imperative is not a utilitarian argument. However, Lacan is also the person who saw Sade as the truth of Kant. In this sense, the utilitarian arguments which led to, among other disciplines, that of political economy, which would come to dominate much of early modern English history, for example, were in their most sophisticated inceptions, such as in the work of Bernard de Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, acutely aware of precisely a calculus of desires in operation. If you recall, the subtitle of that text being Private Vices, Public Benefits. Let me pause here to try and unpack some of the background. Kant's categorical imperative is basically it's what has been referred to as a deontological statement, a statement, or rather a commitment which is not contingent on the circumstances. It is a commitment which, for example, or rather the example that he presents is, if a thief were to ask me a question which may be injurious to me, he actually would, for example, state that it is for me in principle uh, correct to tell the truth to that person, even if I knew that that person was up to nefarious ends. And I'm not very familiar with that. I apologize for the cut in the video. It was an inadvertent mistake on my part. Now, the argument that I was presenting was basically about the categorical imperative and the fact that it isn't a utilitarian argument, the fact that it isn't a commitment that I would make contingent on the utility that it may be of, to me. In this sense, it is deontological in the sense that it is not contingent on the circumstances. It's something that stands perhaps before or something that I accept prior to engaging in the circumstances in question. Now, the reason that assertion is made is, let me just reopen the page. Is because in the stringency of this commitment, Lacan recognizes a certain kind of truth to Kant. A Kant who, for example, has his historical correlate in another French philosopher such as Marquis de Sade, who is, of course, um, perhaps the other way of thinking about such situations as completely, uh, or rather, the other way of conceiving of the subject as completely driven by um, utilitarian and, in fact, hedonistic goals. And it's important to recognize that we cannot really have a really strong ideological or even a conceptual position defined clearly unless we are willing to entertain what an alternative for it may be. This has to do with just being able to grasp how these can coexist in the same time, so to speak, without in some ways provoking the other. But let's not get into that precisely now. Uh, but there is something to be said about the utilitarian arguments themselves. And I think exemplary of them would be political economy. Like, for example, the entire law of the marginal utility per product is based on that. About how, for example, beyond a certain scale, the more coffee I drink, the less the next sip would satisfy me. Because, I've already derived a certain kind of basic marginal utility from it. And this seems to hold across a whole basket of commodities in terms of how customers treat them with their custom in the market. Yet, there is something to be said about its early inception, as I mentioned in Bernard de Mandeville's Fable of the Bees. And this is what I try and point out. Mercantile capital, upon whose basis modern trade found its footing, was built upon the belief that private indulgences may create the opportunity for public gain via the trade of commodities and, among the aristocracy, alliances, commitments, etc. Zizek would expand this register to include our communion with God, in asserting that it pays to be moral, for even if we suffer in life, we will be rewarded for it after our death. And you may say that this is perhaps in some ways his bend towards Protestantism, where there's a certain kind of um, cultivation of the idea of predestination. And I think it's though it's a slight diversion, it helps to be able to cite this here. The Protestant idea of predestination is basically that irrespective of what we do in life, whether someone goes to heaven or not is a decision ultimately made by God, and in that sense, it is predestined. Now, the reason why this argument was in some ways preached by some pastors and stuff like that kind earlier on was because they wanted to assess, or rather, they wanted the motivations behind an action to be self transparent to the person concerned. Like, the reason I would help you would be to help you, not to in some ways instrumentally receive the grace of God or things of that kind. And in this sense, it does mark a certain kind of departure from the Catholic notion of what may be a community. But this is really not terrain that I should indulge in presently. Let me read the following arguments in my introduction. A conceptual point is explicated regarding the Lacanian formulation of desire as one whose account is never finally settled, whose circle is never squared, as it were. For the remainder of any circuit of desire is not as much its result as what allowed the initiation of that drive in the first place. This cause is said to be non-pathological and a priori, assertions which may perhaps be challenged, yet the name which Lacan gives to this factor is the object cause of desire, or the object petit a. An example of this is deemed to be the primordial gift, whose act of giving cannot be accounted for in future exchanges, and in this sense outside or perhaps a priori to their transactions. This leads to, perhaps paradoxically, an important injunction which resembles almost an imperative, that the ethical act proper cannot be reduced to the law of the public good, even if it were to coincide with the ego ideal, and that it has to be distinguished from an injunction by the superego, which functions effectively as the obscene supplement to the ego ideal in many cynical social regimes. Let's explain this via an example. An analogical scenario is not difficult to frame. In India, for instance, to participate in the politics of the party often entails a certain distance kept by an individual to the party line. To take the position of the organization too literally would entail a critique of the doctrine in question, if for no other reason than bringing it to the forefront as what directs the understanding. This is evidenced in the large-scale political horse trading which has become commonplace even among ministers. Another example, perhaps more rooted in history, is also a critique of the right to difference, so celebrated by certain post-colonials. When, for instance, the colonized are expected to become like the imperialist colonizing oppressors, there is often the supplemental assertion made by sections in the know that in some way they are irreducibly other, that they would never be able to succeed. Here, we must assert the right to sameness as the only principle which can unite a universalist politics. Any prefiguration of sameness, however, hides a prehistory. Regarding the Bosnian War, the movie Welcome to Sarajevo is cited, where a mother relinquishes her bond with her child in noticing that she might be happier in her new life in England. The child seals this pact when, in her last phone call, she pretends not to understand Bosnian. The critique of the Western humanist intervention here is a sharp one, for it appreciates that even in their effort at saving the children via relocation and care, effectively the journalist and aid agencies helped the Serbs in their project of ethnic cleansing. In its ability to present the coordinates which such arguments locate within an orthodox Lacanian register, Zizek acknowledges the insight which such a text by Alenka Zupancic is capable of presenting. And with this, we should conclude the introduction. So, just to briefly touch upon some of the themes that may allow us later to see how the focuses of the Ljubljana school come together. The question of the disavowal of that which I would seek to distance from myself, and which is yet constitutive of my own position within a certain symbolic order, is a question and a factor that they would focus on. It's a factor in many ways because they seek to present their work in a certain kind of intervention regarding debates in what was known in the 90s uh, as the culture wars. And of course, one of the outcomes of that was a fierce identity politics, which we noticed um, both inside and outside academia. And I think what they try and highlight is that often these were instrumentalist commitments to positions, and what they subtracted from were real conceptual questions regarding how the subject conceives of, recognizes, and seeks to posit their own interactions amongst others. Yet, I don't think we have gone far enough into any of the um, texts or the context in question to be able to make assertions regarding how successful they may have been. Yet, in recognizing these schisms, these factors in the first place, I would yet say that they, in the spirit of what Judith Butler tries to do in, for example, her studies of subjection in the psychic life of power, they attempt to situate what such a subject may be in their um, most visceral manifestations in the body, in cultural scenarios which may not be easy to interpret. And as we continue our study, we may perhaps come across other such scenarios. Now, this reading has been divided into two parts, unfortunately, because of that small break in the middle. I will try and splice the videos together before uploading them. I will also, of course, as always, leave a link to the original text of the notes under the video in the description. And I would encourage you to read it. If you do have any comments, observations, if any of you are familiar already with Alenka Zupancic's work, kindly, and you are welcome to, leave comments, criticism that may in some ways help orient and focus my own study of her text in question. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you have a lovely day. Bye bye.